I'm Evan Portman with Emerging Civil War, and I'm here with Zachery Fry, who just presented on politics in a time of war, the 1864 election. And I wanted to ask you, you talked a lot about George McClellan. Do you have a favorite George McClellan anecdote or story that you like to share? Maybe something you shared in the talk too?
Oh my gosh. Well, I've really been interested in this story of McClellan giving the address at West Point, because I taught briefly at West Point, and we always think about the Army and the military, and especially the military academy, as being inherently apolitical and nonpartisan, and it should be. But the idea of him going to West Point to deliver a speech in the middle, essentially, of a political campaign where he's running for president as a general in uniform is just fascinating to me. So I've always enjoyed sort of studying McClellan, but once I found out that he did something like that in that kind of context, and then sort of picking apart all the different reactions to it, that was just really striking to me.
No, for sure. That's cool. And one of the challenging things I've found, like in writing and speaking, is taking something complex and kind of distilling it down to something that's understandable.
Yeah,
so
digestible.
How would you go about that, or how have you gone about that with the election of 1864?
It's a real challenge because the issues are so incredibly confusing. And I think adding to the complexity is the fact, as I mentioned during my talk, that the Democratic Party, the party that McClellan represents, he's their standard bearer, is deeply divided in 1864. There's no really coherent policy coming from them that voters have the opportunity to really think about in a clear fashion, because the platform that the Democratic Party adopts in 1864 is one thing, but McClellan's acceptance letter, with kind of a question mark, like he accepted, but did he, is another matter. And when you're going to the ballot box in 1864, which are you voting for? The platform or the candidate? I would say probably the candidate, because he's going to actually be the one governing, not necessarily the platform. But it's still a deeply confused and conflicting event. And so it's a real challenge to try to make sense of it. I do my best just by trying to present as coherently as possible the range of options available to voters in 1864. And as I mentioned during my talk, when you see how the Democratic Party in 1864 is so deeply divided, in a certain way, understanding that complexity is kind of liberating. Because if we just cast the entire Democratic Party as somehow like disloyal or of questionable loyalty during the war, we miss the different gradients of policy within that. And understanding right off the bat that there is this complexity, that there is this wide array of policy preferences within the Democratic Party, I think helps you make sense of the fact that they're just not all treasonous.
Right.
And so, in a sense, sort of appreciating that complexity can be somewhat liberating.
I like that, like kind of acknowledging the nuance up front. And I
definitely
think that could be applicable to the whole discipline of history, probably. But and then my last question would be, what does Emerging Civil War ECW kind of mean to you? What comes to mind? What do you see the value in, and etc.?
It means a lot, because when I was growing up in the 90s, organizations similar to Emerging Civil War existed in much greater quantity, I think, than they do today. Organizations where historians of really varied backgrounds and subject matters could get together and talk to a wide audience, or kind of combine these more traditional lectures like you see sometimes in Emerging Civil War with battlefield tours. There were a lot more of those when I was growing up. There aren't anymore. And the fact that we have something like Emerging Civil War, just from my personal perspective, I think is really good, because it reminds me of sort of the heyday of Civil War studies in the 1990s that I had growing up that was so important in sort of creating my my understanding of the war and my
Right.
interest in it.
Cool. I like that. Some ECW nostalgia
Sure.
there. So thanks again
Yeah.
for your great presentation and talk. And we'll see everyone online and on the battlefield.